So if you know me, you probably are familiar that Angular has been a very important part of my life over the past about 10 years now. Angular helped me kick off my open source journey with this very first pull request that I opened to AngularJS. I just added a missing parenthesis to one of the documentation examples. So only one line changed, but it enabled me to do so many more contributions after that. Angular also helped me in my transition from my home country, Bulgaria, when I relocated all the way to San Francisco, to Silicon Valley. I was able to find my community thanks to Angular by organizing the Angular San Francisco meetups. So that is why I'm so happy to be back here after 3 years to see you all here in person. A lot of things changed over the past 3 years in the world and also on the Angular team. A lot of long-term team members left the team and they started their new career journeys. And we're going to miss them, and we're really happy for them as well. New leaders joined the team in the meantime. Here we have Madleina, who is a Googler with over 15 years of experience in Google Search. She is the engineering manager for the entire Angular platform team. We have also Sarah Drasner. I'm sure you're familiar with Sarah from the internet. Sarah was part of the Vue core team, running developer experience for Netlify, and now an engineering director for the entire Google core developer web organization that is building web infrastructure for the entire Google. Angular is one of her teams. We also have Dawn. She is the product lead for this entire organization, leading over 60 projects, I think. Jeremy is the technical lead for Angular, and I lead DevRel and support product. So over the next couple of days, you're going to meet many more folks from the Angular team. We have Christina and Simona here as engineering managers, Doug, Christian, Pavel, Mark, and Emma. So please join us for our meet and greet breakfasts over the next couple of days so that we can chat about Angular and just brainstorm how we can make that web ecosystem better. The things that changed were not only on the Angular team itself, structurally, but also in the technology that we have been building. I don't remember the last time, like in 2019, if you remember, but like we were promising how we were going to ship Ivy. And here it is, Ivy is out, and it enabled us to develop so many new APIs on top of it that we're going to talk about over the next couple of days. Vue Engine is now history, and yeah, Ivy enables us to do a lot of innovation on Angular. Sarah is going to talk more about the innovation that Angular introduced to the web ecosystem and how we're going to continue moving this forward in her part.
Thanks, Minko. Hey, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you all today. I mean, this is really, really thrilling. It's my first time being at an in-person conference for 2 years, and so this is really nice to see all of the Angular community all together. Our collective understanding of innovation is wrong. It may first seem like most problems are solved and innovations are introduced by a single point of light, a lone person having a eureka moment. However, we can see that for any major innovation, this is just not the case. For instance, let's take the story of who invented the computer. It may at first seem linear, like a single event and single implementation was the start. However, it was not one, but many steps forward. Maybe under certain definitions, it was the ENIAC, widely regarded as the first electronic, general-purpose, and digital computer. There were other computers that did the same, but ENIAC was the first one that had them all in one package. That said, it wasn't binary. Colossus also was regarded as one of the world's first programmable digital computers, although it was programmed by switches and plugs and not by a stored program. Binary being pretty important, maybe we want to trace it back to Aiken's Mark I, which had binary principles but wasn't electronic. However, the Z3 and Z4 were the first programmable computer. Atanasoff and Berry designed the first digital electronic computer, and the first time a computer was able to store information on its main memory. But none of these would have been possible without Turing and Claude Shannon evolving critical theory around computers. But also EDVAC, Manchester Baby, and Ferranti Mark I added to all of this spectrum of innovation. And of course, none of this would have been possible without Jacquard's loom, which was a set of cards to produce a pattern in a weave and a cloth. Or Babbage, who created two mechanical calculators. One was the difference engine, and one was the unfinished analytical machine. Or Ada Lovelace, who invented the concepts of modern computers, including software and subroutines. She thought about how computers could handle any subjects, not just numbers, and published the first computer program. But then it really depends on your definition of computer, doesn't it? Because what do you mean by a modern computer? What would the computer be without the computer chip, which evolved much later? Or what about a prototype at a research center for augmenting human intellect that included a mouse and a GUI? And really, where would modern computing be without the development of Ethernet for connecting computers and hardware? As Matt Ridley says in How Innovation Works, the invention of a computer can no more be pinpointed into a single product than one can pinpoint the moment a child becomes an adult. For even with all of these pieces, we can see that they're interconnected, not just on a linear timescale, but also connected by what spectrum of innovation it pushed forward most. And thus, we see that innovation is a system, a series of interconnected frequencies. Innovation is connections. Innovation is a network. Yet many talk about innovation like a light bulb turning on, an aha moment that strikes only the most brilliant of all creators. But even the light bulb was invented by 21 people at the same time in different countries. Edison might have gotten that final patent over the line, but the innovation of the light bulb was slow, cumulative, and inevitable. Innovation is not a single eureka moment. So how do we take something and make something entirely new and useful out of things that existed before? How do we create a seismic shift out of things that already were here? We often talk about waves of JavaScript frameworks, that single moment in time that a JavaScript framework hits massive relevance. But we don't talk about what makes a wave. Waves are not created on their own. They are created by a force of nature, the wind. And so today, as we talk through innovation in the industry, we're going to talk about the wind and the waves. I'm Sarah Drasner. So who am I to talk about all of this stuff anyway? Back in the day, I was a React developer. I keynoted React Rally in 2016 on this very stage. And I eventually found Vue and became very enamored with it and became a Vue core team member. In September of last year, I joined Google as Director of Engineering for Infrastructure, as Minko mentioned, where I run teams that includes but is not limited to JavaScript and TypeScript languages and libraries at Google, Sass and CSS, web testing including Karma, and a few frameworks, and one of them, of course, is Angular. I don't personally run the Angular team, Madleina does, but you can think of me as like Angular's grandma. And though I'm going to focus a lot on Angular today, know that I could tell all of these stories from the perspective of multiple frameworks. However, what I think is really unique and intriguing about Angular is how well it has survived. It has shaped and influenced multiple JavaScript waves in ways that I think few fully realize. And in turn, it learns and grows and is continuing to grow and evolve by the community that surrounds it. So basically, when I see other frameworks thriving, I feel happy for them too. So, which leads me to, how did we all get here? And how did Angular play a part? Now, I'm going to talk about where things were, and there's a potential for this to be a hot topic. So I'll warn you, this is a contentious area. It's my point of view, and folks might not agree on every single point. But it is important to kind of look at the past and to see where we're going. Remember how I said that innovation was more like a network or a system than a single moment? And remember how I said Angular has stood the test of time? Well, none of these frameworks were made from thin air. The first version of Angular, AngularJS, was one of the first modern JS frameworks, and it drew inspiration from predecessors like Rails and jQuery, although I wouldn't put Rails and jQuery in a modern framework bucket. So those are kind of the predecessors. So Angular JS, handlebars was inspired by jQuery, and Angular JS was inspired a lot by Rails and jQuery as well, especially for MVC kind of approaches. And now Backbone and now Ember was built by Yehuda Katz and Tom Dale. Yehuda Katz actually worked on handlebars, so he was inspired by that, but he was also inspired by Angular and Rails. And Backbone was also inspired by Angular and inspired by Rails. And Knockout was inspired by Rails and handlebars and introduced some important concepts like computed properties. From there, we saw React enter the ecosystem, and it had a different approach, right? It looked at the view layer only, not an full-blown MVC approach. That said, it was still inspired by Angular JS. It was inspired by Backbone and Elm for its Redux state management, which at the time was really, an important part of the ecosystem. Angular, as it is today, of course, was inspired by Angular JS, but it was also inspired by React and some others, and Vue was inspired by everyone. Vue took a lot of the view layer approaches from React, and a lot of the kind of HTML binding approaches from Angular JS, and a lot of the computed properties approaches from Knockout. Now, Svelte did the same. It kind of looked at the modern framework landscape and kept simplifying, but leaned more into the compiler for some of the reactivity approaches that it had and simplified some of those state stores. Now, I'm not going to tell you where it's going because I'm not a weatherman. But I will say that there are some really interesting things happening in the landscape today. So we don't know what exactly is going to occur, but Solid and Quick are making some really interesting and compelling advancements in the space. Meta frameworks like Nuxt and Next have really come onto the scene and seen massive adoption, actually, along with their kind of core frameworks. So that's also worth mentioning. So I mentioned that Angular influenced a lot, and it might be hard to see because the sands of time have a way of kind of washing these things away, but Angular developed SPAs, first-class usage of TypeScript, test integrations and harnesses that are baked right into the ability to create components, tree shaking, ahead-of-time compilation, and the first compile time and built-in internationalization. And it also had mature CLI-driven updates, of which, it is still the front runner in the industry. Angular is currently inspired by other people as well, though. It's inspired by Svelte's authoring simplicity, Vue's approach to single file components, Svelte's stores and simplified state management, Solid's reactivity, React's unidirectional data flow, Vue's animations, and as Kara is going to talk about in the future, Aurora seen in Next.js's image component and some of the Core Web Vitals approaches to ways of rendering images. So this doesn't mean that this is exactly where we're going in the future, but these are just some of the things that inspire us in the Angular team. So let's look at yesterday for just a second. You may have noticed that some of the improvements to Angular's external feature set has slowed down over the last few years, calling into question, where is Angular going? Well, the team had to pause on some of those features due to Ivy. Ivy was a massive ground-up rewrite of Angular's renderer. Ivy was our exploration of how to build a framework that can evolve over time. That was shipped in the last year. So you can actually liken this update to actually other updates like this in the ecosystem. For anyone who's a React OG, you may have remembered React Fiber many years ago. The team worked on changes to the reconciliation algorithm under the hood. And also recently, Vue did an update to the internals called Vue 3, rewritten in TypeScript, and a complete rewrite of the reactivity system. So what do all of these under-the-hood rewrites have in common? They have massive gains with a slight trade-off that some other work on the framework can slow for a time. However, Ivy brought with it so many great improvements. We have code health and the architecture of the framework, and it's all in a hugely better place to make adjustments and add features in the future. A better IDE experience, some speed improvements that we saw, especially within Google, and improved compilation errors. So zooming in on that last one for improved compilation errors, let's say you add a component without fully registering it. Now there's more CLI information about what's missing and what's there, so that you can spend less time debugging and more time being productive. So that brings us to today. Now that these updates are done and Angular is evolving, What are we focusing on? I'm going to talk about two major things that we're focused on and kind of zoom in on advanced features, and then Madleina is going to bring you into the future. So some of the advanced features that you may have seen just coming out are strictly typed forms, updates and error handling, and streamlining page title accessibility. So first, we'll talk about strictly typed forms. You're going to hear much more about this from Dylan on Friday in a talk that I'm really excited about, but I'll just address it at a high level. So one of Angular's nice features is built-in form validation. You can see how easily I write and build in reactive form validation in only a few lines of code and no external library or setup compared to other frameworks. However, in previous versions of Angular, even if I wrote this validation, the type was cast to any. And that's kind of a shame, given the fact that we lean so heavily on TypeScript to do some of that type validation. You can see here how many people asked for this. That is almost 1,000 thumbs up on the GitHub repo issue. So as we got done with Ivy, we were very hungry to get this update through. Oh no, but have no fear. We just added a feature that is both something that should be improved and also something that's way ahead. Other frameworks don't have this. Angular already has form validation baked in, and now we leverage the use of TypeScript for some strongly typed forms and validations as well. It's Angular's most requested feature, now shipped in v14. To see it in use, you can see how many great insights and type checking we have in our form, making the debugging and developer experience so much more powerful without having to add any external libraries. Up next, I already mentioned that Angular has been ahead of its time in terms of updates and migration, but ng-update and ng-schematics has recently been worked on to provide even more detail and useful information. So some of this is due to the fact that Angular runs at scale for such projects like Google Cloud internally. Angular has some of the most sophisticated upgrade functionality in the industry. Within Google, we do what we call LSCs, or large-scale changes, and use commands to transform the code bases fairly seamlessly, providing sophisticated logs and error reporting along the way, something that other frameworks don't do with quite this robust error logging and documentation. This also means that Angular can continuously improve over time with smaller risks to its users for breakages. And code bases aren't littered with many, many different ways of writing and doing things, which also allows developers to onboard and be productive faster. It's often the case that in large code bases, you start to have many, many different things laying around, and that increases tech debt. This is something that Angular does really, really well. So we've now created enhanced template diagnostics, which give great error detection, especially for common user errors that could potentially be difficult to debug for people first working with the framework. Here we see a binding error that we affectionately call the banana in the box error, because it looks like a banana in a box, and bananas are arguably the funniest fruit. Other better error messages include nullish coalescing errors and tree-shakeable error messages. So we now have more new runtime error codes. These error codes make finding references and any errors you encounter a lot easier. This also allows the build optimizer to tree-shake error messages from your production bundles. Angular CLI also offers some autocomplete functionality as well, which keeps developers in the flow of their work more readily. So let's talk last about streamlining page title accessibility. This is actually a really important feature for SPA approaches, because without some intention here, the title of each page will remain the same, which is the first thing that a screen reader reads upon root change. As of version 13.2, Angular Router offers a new streamlined title property that allows people with assistive technology to understand the content and the title and the purpose of the page. You can also create more complex logic for dynamic and conditional page titles as well by extending the title strategy. So coming up, you'll be able to see a lot of really great improvements, many of which, as I mentioned before, are inspired by a lot of the great work in the industry. Things like easier and simplified APIs, including state management, a revamp of the reactivity system, improved performance, image component, script loading, and thinking about core web vitals, better hydration for server-side rendering, better stack traces, better accessibility, and more reusable headless ARIA primitives, and a documentation revamp. Angular both pushes the web framework ecosystem forward, and it learns from and is inspired by those around it. And this is how we all evolve. It's never in isolation. It's from learning from each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I get to tell you a little bit about where we want to take Angular in the next few years. Because as Sarah just talked about, a lot of this is about innovation in a network. But we also realized we needed a bit of a focus to that. Because if we tried to do everything, we're not going to get very far. And so what we wanted to do was find that focus. And what we did is pay a little bit more close attention to all of the feedback we've been getting from you guys. To those of you who have taken the developer survey, thank you. We got almost 25,000 responses, which is a little overwhelming to actually read all of them. But it does actually give us great insight into what's working, and more importantly, what is not working. And also start understanding the trends in what's not working. There's another source that we found a lot of inspiration from, and that is the feature triaging. And I'm going to pause here 1 second to show off a little bit, because I'm very, very proud of what the team has accomplished here. Because over the last 2.5 years, we've managed to go from almost 3,000 issues open to almost 1,000 issues open. And we're going to cross that barrier very soon. We just got a little distracted this last month prepping for all of the great talks we're giving here today. But I'm sure we're going to cross that boundary very, very soon. One of the questions you might have, because we get asked a lot of this one, is how do we do it? And it's simple, it's persistent, but it requires hard work to stay with it. And so what we've done is set aside time each week to take a look at the issues. And while in each session we might only tackle a few of them, over time you start eroding away that backlog, and this is how we've managed to reduce it by more than half. But the other thing that happened, and this is where we started with it, or where I started with this thread, it started to make us understand more the patterns that are going on. And more than that, we started seeing some root causes that are common to a lot of different symptoms to understand what might be more fundamentally need to be changed instead of just the surface features that are being talked about. There's one other source we wanted to start paying more attention to, and that is people who are not using Angular. Whether or not that is users who've started using Angular and then walked away, or those who never tried, because they have a very different perspective on what might be missing from Angular and what we might have to add in order to make it work for them as well. And we'll never work for everybody, but that doesn't mean we can't work for a little bit more people than we are today. And as part of that, we started partnering with some companies to do some user research studies. And one of the more interesting ones we did recently is learning how people make choices about frameworks, or how people at companies make those choices. And I'm happy to talk with anyone later on about that research or any thoughts you have on that topic as well. So beyond listening, there's another source we wanted to find on where to go. And that is we wanted to play a little bit more with our own framework. Because we get very, very busy working on Angular, we don't often get to work with Angular. And so we wanted to take the time to build applications ourselves to experience a little bit more firsthand what it is like using Angular. And then we decided to expand a little bit more and look at the other frameworks. Because as Sarah pointed out earlier, there's a lot of inspiration drawn from each other, and has been in the past, and we continue that as well. And what we wanted to focus on was the differences, but even more importantly, what are the commonalities? And what are the dimensions that influence how you build a framework? And what are decisions you should be thinking about making as we evolve into the future? So as we went through all of this, there was one theme that kept coming up over and over again, and that is developer experience, which is what we want to focus on over the next few years. Now, it comes as no surprise to any of you that developer experience matters. Because I know you've had that experience, because I've had that experience, that there is a piece of code that is hard to parse, a tool that just wasn't running the first time, a test that just will not pass, that throws you out of the flow, makes you feel unproductive. And really, we're here to make you productive and allow you to build the best web experience with the least friction. But there's another reason developer experience matters. And there was a survey from GitHub recently called the Octoverse one, which showed that developer experience also influences and improves collaboration and team culture, which in turn, again, improves your productivity and also makes you happier in doing your job. And at the end of the day, that's what should matter the most. You should have fun with your job as well, not just feel drudgery. Now, developer experience is very broad. And what we actually found is two sub-themes that we came across the most as we were looking at the feedback we've been hearing. And the first one is the learning journey. This is my visualization of what it felt a little bit getting started with Angular, where there was quite a few steps, some of them a little steep. There was a lot to learn to get to that first app and that first taste of success. And the taste of success is what keeps you going. And then from there, there's more steps to the next step, whether or not that is an expansion of your first app or a new app altogether. And so what kept resonating, and a phrase we kept using in our internal talks, was reducing our learning curve and getting to this kind of a picture, where each step is a little smaller and smoother to get from one to the other, so that you have continual taste of success and keeps you hooked, and it works. Your journey works with you as you need to learn more instead of having to learn everything up front. There's a second theme we found, which is that while you're within the well-defined boundaries of Angular, there might be some rocks, but it gets really bad when you have to leave that well-lit path. And there are good reasons for having to leave it, because there's always more ways that everybody's pushing web development, and we sometimes need to learn first where you want to push it before we can make it better. But today, you're going to have some really big boulders, and you're going to have some really steep cliffs where you're going to have to go really deep into internals of Angular to understand how it works in order to get your job done. And so this is where we ended up, and we keep talking about in our team, is developer experience is our top goal, and within that, we want to reduce the learning curve, get more people, oh, there we go, get more people started on learning Angular, and reduce the cliff when you have to leave the well-lit path that Angular supports today. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about some of the stuff we've done recently, because it actually already plays into what we're planning to do in this theme of developer experience, which is really exciting to me. And I have to start with standalone components, because they're the poster child for me, right? As you can tell, it drastically reduces the amount of code you have to write. But the part that for me was even more exciting is the way it feeds into reducing the learning journey, because now you don't have to learn about ng modules when you first get started to get to that first app, and you can wait to learn about it until you need it for your app, until it becomes complicated enough and complex enough that ng modules give you a very real benefit to using them. And that is how you reduce the learning journey too, is not removing concepts entirely, but being able to defer them until it makes more sense in your learning journey. Now, I think for most of you, actually, the real question you have is, when are you going to remove the developer preview label? And what we wanted to do was make sure it fit very well before we got there. And the first one we needed to do was make sure that the APIs were well done before we ended up making them public and fully final. And to all of you who've used it already and were willing to try out a developer preview label, did I just lose the mic? No, OK. Sorry, there was an echo before that I didn't hear anymore, so I got confused for a second. So those of you who tried the APIs in the developer preview and were brave enough, thank you, because with you, we've been able to now say, yes, the APIs we have, we feel comfortable making them public and final. But there's another thing we wanted to do, was make sure it was integrated well across the entire API surfaces. Because we just talked about it with developer experience. It's not a great experience if you end up using it in parts of Angular, but you can't use it in other parts. And so we've been adding it across the board, such as the router, HTTP clients, elements, and many other places, in order to make sure that if you want to use standalone components, you can use it holistically across all of Angular. And together, we now feel comfortable saying, yes, we are going to remove developer preview as a label in v15. And if you want to learn more about the power of standalone component, the motivation, and how they're actually different from ng modules, come see Pavel talk this afternoon at 3 p.m., because it'll give you more insight into them, because there's some subtlety on how they're actually different from ng modules. Woo! But beyond the developer experience on their own, standalone components has also allowed us to do some really nifty things. And the one I'm enjoying the most is the fact that it allows me to break inheritance restrictions in some cases. I know there's been a long desire to want to inherit from more than one component. And we're now able to introduce a new API called the Directive Composition API that is going to allow you to do this. So in this example, I want to build a new cool menu that inherits from the CDK tooltip and most of its properties. But then it also inherits properties of the disabled and the closed parts from the CDK menu to build a new cool component that is a super part of two of them. Isn't that cool? I know I'm excited. If you want to know more about it, Christian is here today as well in the next few days. Chat with him about it because he's been building it. And I hope you guys get to use it for building a lot of cool new components. Standalone components was also a large part of helping us build some router improvements. The first one, and this is the one I was most involved with, is improving the lazy loading of components, making it easier and more accessible for everybody, making it a little bit easier to not get it wrong. But we've done some other things too. We've improved the config API to allow tree shaking of some major pieces, and together that means there's an 11% reduction in the bundle size from being able to do these tree shaking, which is exciting. And lastly, we've added functional router guards. And that means we are now from a point where this is what the router used to look like. And the point is you don't actually have to read it, is we're able to get down to this. This is smaller, easier to read, and a lot more like English in order to understand what it is all about. Which, again, developer experience, you can see a lot of our work has already fit in with that. Now, some of you might have already noticed one keyword on that previous slide, which is the inject function. You guys took us a little bit by surprise on how enthusiastic you were for this, especially because, as Alex put it, it was just a bug fix. What is this all about? But we can't blame you, because it is actually a really cool feature. What it allowed us to do in that previous slide is inject the login service directly and just call in the function. And this is so much easier to use and so much easier to read, of being able to say, you can activate this if someone is logged in. It's all in one line without having to go somewhere else to read it. Probably more canonically, you're going to use it as part of constructors. And not only is it, again, easier to read, but the more important part is now also type safe. So you're making sure that what you're injecting actually does what it does and is what you expect it to be as a type. I also want to talk a little bit about components, because we've been focused a lot on the framework, but we've also been working hard on the component side. And in V14, we've introduced the menu item and the dialog box. And the reason I like CDK primitives is because it allows us to give you best practices and include accessibility for components that then allow you to extend them and make them work for your UIs. And most recently, we added one more, which is the list box. And we're continuing to add more, so keep an eye out on seeing which ones we're going to be able to do next here. Now, the one you're probably even more interested to hear about is what's going on with Angular material components. We've been working hard, and some of you have been spying on some of our GitHub CLs to see what's going on here. And these are the new components that we've built on top of the Angular CDK and using web primitives from the material organization. This allows us to stay more up to date with what material is doing and reuse the same functionality to get that UI while also reusing the business logic we've already built up in the CDK menu. We're far enough along that we're pretty confident that all of the components that have a web primitive equivalent will release in V15 to be ready used for everyone. We'll have more details on the upgrade path, because as always, we want to make it easy for you to get there as well as we get closer to the date. But there's one other part about this that I'm excited about, which is we already know how we can use these to build a better theming API, so that you can take these components and adjust it more easily to your UX specs and your UX guidelines, instead of strictly adhering to the material ones, making it a little bit easier to use. I'm going to close with a little bit of a hint on some of the major directions we're looking at as part of this developer experience focus. And the first one is documentation. It is often an underrated part of the developer experience, because we're not always the best at reading the manual. But when we do, it often is helpful if it's written well. And that's what we want to focus on. And what we found is there are two types of changes we're focusing on at the moment. The first type is what I call the pebble changes. These are smaller changes to improve the current experience without an overhaul. And in this case, we're working on simplifying the words and having a more consistent presentation of topics. Together, these will allow to reduce your cognitive load as you're reading them, so you can focus more on the content of what you're absorbing without having to trip over words or a different order of information from different topics. And then on the larger side, and this is still very new, so we don't have a lot of details yet, is we want to really look at that initial learning journey and see what we can even do today in presenting how you get started with Angular in a more smooth way, in a smaller step way, and get you going faster. But then we also want to look at the usability of the docs as is for more advanced users and get you to the topic you need faster. And we're still understanding what your patterns are in order to understand how we're going to improve this. The next area we're really focusing on is hydration. I know, everybody's quite excited about that one, isn't it? On the smaller side, we realized that we were failing a little bit on the documentation angle, and I just said how important it is. So we need to overhaul that a little bit, make sure it's actually complete and up-to-date and accurate in these ways. We've also already did the work for integrating standalone components, but we also want to look at what are smaller bugs that don't require changing how hydration works today. But then we're also going to look at partial hydration, because that's going to be our big rock here, of really wanting to push it forward. We're going to do this jointly with the Aurora team, and Minko in a few minutes is going to tell you more about the team and how we collaborate with them. But if you want to know more about where we are with hydration, and really only started talking about this like a month or two ago, so we are at the very beginning of the journey here, find Jessica or Kara from the Aurora team and ask them about what their latest thinking is about where hydration might be going next. Lastly, reactivity. Or, I think as I learned to call it, we want to change the underlying change detection system for Angular and see how we can make it better than it is today. Now, this one, we were definitely very early stage. And what we've done is we started asking ourselves some questions to explore the space. Could we have a zoneless Angular? Could we have per-component change detection? Should we have stores for state management? And one of Sarah's favorites, I know, is could we have computed properties? She's been asking about that since she started. So maybe we can finally give her that. We actually don't know the answers to any of these questions yet, although Pavel has been sharing some of his thoughts on Twitter. And I know he and Alex are very happy to talk with anyone in the hallways about where they are with any of the thoughts they have on these topics. And on that, I will also, wait, there we go. Plug the fact that Alex and Jeremy are going to give a presentation this afternoon, which is called a design review 10 years late, but it also starts giving insight into what they're thinking as we evolve Angular and what are the dimensions we have to make decisions about, both for reactivity and many other topics. So that's another good one to come and see what we're thinking about. So as we're working on documentation, hydration, reactivity, and any other big boulders we're going to add, we don't want to lose track of making other improvements, such as continuing to work on accessibility, continuing to work on improving components, pushing out the material ones, improving build speed improvements, and continuing to work on highly requested features that are not requiring us to fundamentally change Angular just yet. And that is a lot. And we can't do this all alone. And so Minko is going to tell you more about how partnerships fit into us delivering this vision of really overhauling the developer experience for Angular.
All right, I have a couple of partnerships I'd like to talk about, which are primarily focused on better developer experience and performance. The first one is our partnership with the Aurora team. So Aurora is part of Chrome. And as you know, Chrome is one of the major web browsers out there. And one of their main goals is to make the web platform successful. A core part of it is to enable users to have great experience when they're using the web platform. So they developed a set of metrics that are user-centric metrics to enable us to just put a number on the experience that users have using our applications. This set of metrics is called Core Web Vitals. The Aurora team is supporting web frameworks so that they can enable developers to build web applications that meet Core Web Vitals. We have been collaborating with the Aurora team for a couple of years now. We did some improvements in our build pipeline so that we can enable build time optimizations to allow better runtime performance. But I'm really happy to announce that we are ramping our partnership on another level. Over the next couple of quarters, we'll be working on improving further our build time optimizations. However, we'll be also exploring how we can make the server-side rendering story for Angular better, which includes improvements in developer and user experience. We'll be also shipping a stable version of our image directive that is now in developer preview in version 14.2. The best thing about the image directive is that it works really well with the Angular's template syntax and dynamic scoping that we provide in templates. So you don't have to really rewrite your application. All you need to do is import the image directive in a standalone component or in an ng module, And from there, just update the src attributes to raw src, and you're going to start seeing improvements in your application's core web vitals. You can learn more about our partnership with Aurora in Hussein's community keynote on Friday, and also about the image directive in Kara's talk on Friday about best practices with Angular. Another partnership that we really value is with Firebase. A couple of years ago, we shipped ng-deploy together with them, and we enabled developers to deploy their applications to Firebase following best practices directly from the Angular CLI. The Fireship realized that a lot of people really like their CLI tool, so inspired by ng-deploy reusing some of the functionality, they developed framework-aware deployments directly from the Firebase CLI that would work with client-side rendering, server-side rendering, where they're going to upload your assets to Firebase hosting and move your server to a Firebase function, and also with pre-rendering or static site generation. They're still working on this functionality, so make sure you follow Firebase for announcements when this is available. Before you deploy your application, you have to build it, so most likely you run ng-build in one form or another. Here, we're passing your application to a set of optimizations through our build pipeline. We compile everything with the Angular compiler, we pass it to Webpack to bundle everything, and after that, we pass your codes to ESBuild, which is a highly optimized JavaScript bundler and code optimizer that is implemented in Go. After that, we pass everything to Cursor so that we can enable further compression, and finally, we deliver your production assets. This is a pretty efficient pipeline, but it's not the fastest one. And we've been hearing from a lot of people that they would like to use something like Vite. So we invited Evan Yu, the creator of Vite, and also Vue, to give a talk to the Angular team so that we can brainstorm together how we can enable a Vite-inspired solution within the Angular CLI. And probably you're familiar that ESBuild is a core part of Vite. So we're happy to share that we are working on an experimental builder that simplifies our build pipeline using this Vite-inspired solution with ESBuild, performing bundling and code compression to produce the production assets of your application. Currently, based on early benchmarks, we found that the code builds are 57% faster for your production assets. We just introduced this experimental support, and it currently supports Sass as well. And you can give it a try by updating your Angular.json and replacing the current browser builder with the ESBuild builder. So give it a try and give us your feedback. If something breaks, just open an issue on GitHub. We'd love to fix it. So for Google, privacy and security has always been a main focus. And for us on the Angular team, being part of Google, we always wanted to enable developers to build secure applications. So we're really happy to share that we're part of Google's open source software vulnerability reward program. All right, I said the whole thing. We are one of the 5 flagship projects, and you can make up to $31,000 if you find a critical security vulnerability on Angular and you report it. You can find more about the security vulnerability reward program at the link at the bottom left of the slide. And you can learn more about how we're keeping Angular secure in Jessica and Joey's talk later today. So Angular's mission has always been to enable developers to deliver their web applications with confidence, right? We wanted to provide you the tool sets to follow best practices to deliver applications that your users love. And we have been embedding best practices in our tooling from the beginning. Our Angular CLI generates code following the Angular style guide. We have commands for end-to-end testing, for unit testing. We even had a benchmarking framework, BenchPress. And historically, we have been maintaining all of this ourselves. But we recently realized that Angular is actually really good in enabling developers to build challenging user experiences. We are not really in the business of building end-to-end testing frameworks. So by collaborating with the ecosystem, and by still enabling best practices, we just want to meet developers where they are. And we originally started this in version 11 with the deprecation of TSLint. We collaborated with James Henry from the community to enable ESLint support through a community maintained builder. We expanded this in version 12 by enabling you to use the end-to-end testing framework that you love, like Cypress, Nightwatch.io, or WebDriver.io. And we're going to continue this effort further, exploring more partnerships and expansion of the scope. And if you're an Angular developer, I'm sure that you have filled our Angular developer survey or you're familiar with it. This is core inspiration for us to see what partnerships we should establish and how we can improve the developer experience further. To my knowledge, this is the biggest front-end survey out there with about 25,000 responses, and we're very grateful for your feedback because this helps us make Angular better. We get a lot of open-ended and close-ended answers, and we are figuring out that we found from one of these surveys that one of the major pain points for developers is debugging. So after digging deeper into the open-ended answers, we found a couple of areas for potential improvements. Error messages were pretty confusing, right? Change detection, there is an opportunity for improvements to figure out what exactly is happening in your change detection, how long do you spend in it, and what triggers it, and also dependency injection. So to fix or to improve this, we first looked at all of our error messages, all of them, and we tried to categorize them and prioritize them based on how many people have Googled a particular error message. Right after that, we assigned unique code for each error message, and we expanded the context. For example, we figured out the topological sort for the cyclic dependencies in dependency injection, and we're providing it now. And we developed guides that we publish on Angular.io, and we linked within the error messages. So now when you get expression has changed after checked, you're getting a URL to Angular.io where you can find more context about the error. And also, if you would like to consume the content in a visual format, we partnered with Fireship.io so that we can deliver engaging content. Another improvement was around change detection. So we partnered with Wrangle to develop Angular DevTools. Angular DevTools allows you to profile your Angular application and preview the execution of the change detection. So each individual change detection cycle will appear as it happens. You'll be able to see how many change detection cycles are triggered, what triggered them, and also how long did you spend in each one of them. Originally, we released this. Thank you. We originally released this for Chrome, and by default, it supported Edge as well. However, there was an overwhelming feature request. Like, people really wanted to see support for Firefox, so we enabled that in version 14 too. And I'm really happy to share that we partnered with Apple so that we can enable support for Safari as well. Dependency injection is still confusing, though. You are sometimes not really sure what are the dependencies of your components, what are their dependencies, and where all these dependencies combined are coming from which injector. So we continue to experiment and expand Angular DevTools. Now we have an experimental version in which you can preview the dependencies of your components directly from the Component Explorer. You can preview the injector tab in the side panel. You can see where these dependencies are coming from which injector specifically. And for a more holistic view, you can preview the entire injector tree. When you click on an injector, you can see the exact providers that are declared within them and their dependencies. So this is still in a developer preview. Would love your feedback, though. You can find how you can give this extension a try here at the bottom right of the slide. And thank you. And I don't know if you remember the error messages. They're taking a significant part of this pie chart in terms of confusion. Well, we partnered with Chrome DevTools. Chrome DevTools, they have the mission to enable developers to have great debugging experience. And we partnered together to improve the errors for everyone. So let us first look at the typical experience you get when you face an error in Angular. Here is a simple component that pretty much sets a loading flag to true, sends a request, and set it to false after. If you get an error in the request, you're going to get a stack trace similar to this one here. Right? It's only one call frame is code that you actually altered. And in an attempt to understand this better, you're going to expand the stack trace so that you can get the structure stack trace that is coming directly from Chrome DevTools. And it gets kind of more confusing. You see Zone.js, core, subjects, and other scripts that you have actually never touched, and it's not your job to touch them. So after partnering for a couple of months, we changed this structured stack trace to this here. Now we're really happy to share that you can actually use the most powerful debugging tool out there to just understand your error messages. You can follow the execution of your application from the moment that it got bootstrapped all the way until the error happened. And let me show you how this works. First, this is the confusing error. You get only one call frame that is related to code that you actually altered. The first thing that we do is to trim the unnecessary part. We're instructing Chrome DevTools through the Angular CLI that it should ignore scripts that are outside of your application directory. Now, the next thing is the one that I'm the most excited about. It will benefit pretty much every single Angular developer every single day. Chrome DevTools developed, in partnership with us, the async stack tagging API that allows us to stitch asynchronous stack traces together for a more holistic view of your code execution. So you can trace the click, after that, the execution of the submit method, after that, go to the request, figure out the fetch, and get the error at the end. And to take this one step further, we're also exploring how we can make this last line in the stack trace better. Rather than seeing Ivy-generated code, we would ideally want to show you something that you actually altered. So we would like to make the stack trace friendlier. All right, this is coming soon, so not there yet. But as part of version 15, you should be able to get this completeness of the stack traces, since we augmented Zone.js to take advantage of this async stack tagging API. And you know what my favorite part of all of this is? You're never, ever going to step into Zone.js ever again. And yeah, you're going to get a readable stack trace. So that's pretty much everything we had for you today. The 3 takeaways from this presentation, I guess, are that we're really focused on enabling performance by default. And we really value this partnership with Aurora that we're going to talk more about over the next couple of days. We're investing in improvements in our server-side rendering pipeline, and also enabling best practices by default. So you don't really need to think about how you can configure your application to be fast. We're also working really hard on improving developer experience by enabling flexibility and simplicity with features such as standalone components. Also working on faster and more ergonomic tooling and partnering with the larger tooling ecosystem so that we can meet developers where they are and provide a more holistic developer experience with the best tools that you love. Thank you so much.